I watched the debate between James White, Jeff Durbin, and the two atheists. The video is called Atheist Unhinged, and I've linked to it in this description. And there are 2 points made several times by the atheist side, which I think the Christians didn't answer correctly. I'm a presuppositionalist, and I've had to deal with these types of arguments, and I'd like to suggest what I believe is a good answer. And I hope it can help you in the defense of the faith. Let me say first of all that this isn't a criticism of James White or Jeff Durbin. It's very easy for me sitting here in front of my computer, pressing pause and thinking to come up with a better answer, especially with such a crazy debate opponent as Dr. Clark, who was very distracting. And I also want to say that I respect and appreciate the great work that Dr. White does. I have some of his books and listen regularly to The Dividing Line. I also admire Jeff for his ministry and his work to save the lives of babies. This video is about the atheist's claim, particularly Dr. Clark, that he could make exactly the same assertions about Godzilla as the Christians make for their God. This is a very common tactic from atheists when they debate Christians. We've all heard it, whether it's Godzilla, the flying spaghetti monster, Zeus, the sky fairy, Allah, etc. Dr. Clark made this argument a few times in his debate. It is clearly what he felt is a relevant and convincing argument. He made the case for Thor in his opening statement. He went on to make the case for Joseph Smith's revelation and Mormonism. Then he moved on to an invisible Godzilla in the corner of the room. He seemed to opt for Godzilla because of the name Godzilla. I kid you not. Here are some examples.
As Dan has pointed out, as I have pointed out, as you all laughed at Thor, you're not Mormons. I get that. That's the point, is you reject all of that stuff. And there's all these gods out here. So the question is not, does inductive logic work? The question is, does the triune God exist of the Bible? Does not provide 100% certainty.
So you have no answer to Bertrand Russell's problem of induction.
My answer is inductive logic is not imperfect. It does not predict the future. I didn't say inductive logic,
sir. I said the problem of induction, the uniformity in nature, not merely inductive logic.
God did it, provides no explanation whatsoever that's not already in its assumption, and one could just as well say Godzilla did it, and if you want to explain why Godzilla didn't do it, then go right ahead. But that answer is self-referential and empty. But show me a real miracle that would not happen, and any excuse that you use, it has to be better than my excuse for Godzilla was able to do it but didn't want to at this particular point in time. If you can't do any better than that Godzilla in the corner, you can't do anything, and that's what you believe. Godzilla is all-powerful. You're not allowed to question his existence because he is your creator. This is their argument. And therefore, the fact that logic exists, that inductive logic exists, is proof that Godzilla exists.
So, Dr. Clark, you've now abandoned atheism and you're a Godzillaite?
I am saying that those are equally useless.
Can you provide now a justification with Godzillaism for a principle of induction? You haven't solved the problem, Dr. Clark.
I am providing equivalence between what your audience laughed
Dr.
at
Clark,
with
next
respect
question.
to Thor,
Dr.
with
Clark,
respect to Godzilla,
thank you, sir.
and
Thank you,
somehow
sir.
wants to pay you
Next
to
question.
keep preaching.
Jeff answers Dr. Clark that if he believes what he is saying, then he has abandoned atheism. This, of course, is true. If Dr. Clark thinks his premise is true, then not only has he abandoned atheism, he has refuted atheism in his own mind. And if he's abandoned atheism, then the debate is over as far as he is concerned. He has lost the debate and should leave his debate partner, Dan Ellis, to finish off. However, We all know that this is not what the atheist is claiming when he uses this type of analogical argument. And indeed, Dr. Clark says as much. He says the two arguments, the Christian argument and the Godzilla argument, are, I quote, equally useless. And he goes on to clarify his method. I'm quoting again. I am providing equivalence between what your audience laughed at with respect to Thor and with respect to Godzilla. End of quotation. So what Dr. Clark claims he is doing, and what he obviously thinks is a very good argument against the Christian God, is that he can make the same argument as the Christian argument, but for any fake God. And as the Christian rejects his fake God, then the Christian has no valid reason to not reject the Christian God. Let's analyze this argument. This video is a little trickier than the last one, but stay with me on this, and I think I can show that the atheist's argument is ultimately self-refuting. The Christian claims he has made a valid argument with a true conclusion, proving the existence of his God. The atheist claims he has made a valid argument with a false conclusion, proving the existence of his fake God. The Christian's argument goes something like this. Premise 1. The triune God is the necessary precondition for the existence of the laws of logic. Premise 2. We know the laws of logic exist because we think them every time we speak. Conclusion. We know the necessary precondition for the existence of the laws of logic exists. Conclusion. We know the Christian God exists. The atheist counteracts with something like this. Premise 1. Godzilla is the necessary precondition for the existence of the laws of logic. Premise 2. We know the laws of logic exist because we think them every time we speak. Conclusion. We know the necessary precondition for the existence of the laws of logic exists. Conclusion. We know Godzilla exists. The atheist claims his argument is valid, but that the conclusion is not true. If he claims the conclusion of his Godzilla argument is true, and the conclusion is we know Godzilla exists, then he is no longer an atheist and he's lost the debate. But that's not what he's saying. He's saying that his argument is as logically valid as the Christian argument, but it's just that the premise for it is not true. Godzilla doesn't really exist, and therefore the conclusion is not true. The conclusion is false. That's his claim. The argument is valid, but it's not true. So, the atheist claims he has made a valid argument with a false conclusion that his fake God exists. And this, he says, refutes the Christian's argument. That is his basic argument. For the remainder of this video, it will be easier for me to make it into a dialogue between the Christian and the atheist. The atheist. So, tell me, why do you reject this Godzilla argument when you accept the Christian argument? The Christian. I reject the Godzilla argument for the same reason you do, because the premise is false. We both know the premise and the conclusion is false. That's why I reject it. The atheist. But you don't get it, do you? This argument is equivalent to your argument for the existence of your God. It's analogical to the Christian's argument. You can't reject one and accept the other. The Christian. Yes, but we both know that the conclusion of your argument is false. That's why I reject it, just as you do. Now, given the fact that you recognize the conclusion of the Godzilla argument is false, yet you present it as a good argument against mine, can you tell me what you think a valid argument with a false conclusion actually proves? Do you think a valid argument with a false conclusion can refute anything at all? The atheist. Okay, my argument may have a false conclusion, but it is a valid argument, which proves the Christian argument's conclusion is false. The Christian. In order for that claim to be true, it would require that a valid argument with a false conclusion refute a valid argument with a true conclusion. The atheist. But your argument for the Christian God does not have a true conclusion. The Christian. That's what we're trying to prove or disprove, isn't it? You can't just assert it, you've got to prove it. And that's why you've used this Godzilla argument. But what we are certain of is that you claim your argument is valid and that the conclusion is false. And I claim my argument is valid and that the conclusion is true. That's what we're certain of. We both agree that each other's arguments are valid. Therefore, in order for your Godzilla argument to refute mine, it must be able to refute an argument that I claim has a true conclusion. The fact that you think that your argument achieves anything at all is crazy. And the fact that you obviously think it's one of your most convincing arguments just shows how weak your position is. For example, here is a valid argument with a false premise and therefore a false conclusion. Here's a valid argument which has, like yours, a false premise and a false conclusion. Premise 1. All dogs have 8 legs. Premise 2. Rover is a dog. Conclusion. Rover has 8 legs. This argument is valid, but the conclusion is false. So, here's my question. What does this argument prove? Can it prove anything? Can it refute any other argument? Could you give me an example of an argument that it refutes? A false argument doesn't even refute another false argument. It's completely useless. So, I ask you my question again. Given the fact that you recognize that the conclusion of your Godzilla argument is false, yet you present it as a good argument against mine, can you tell me what you think a valid argument with a false conclusion actually proves? Do you think a valid argument with a false conclusion can refute anything at all? The atheist. Yes, it refutes your argument about God. The Christian. You claim a valid argument with a false conclusion can actually refute something. Okay, well, as I have already said, in order for your Godzilla argument to refute mine, that would require that a valid argument with a false conclusion refute a valid argument with an alleged true conclusion. In other words, in order for your argument to refute mine as you claim, it requires that a valid argument's conclusion cannot be true if an equivalent valid argument with a false conclusion can be made against it. I'm going to say that again. In other words, in order for your argument to refute mine as you claim, that requires that a valid argument's conclusion cannot be true if an equivalent valid argument with a false conclusion can be made against it. That's your assertion. Your whole proof depends on this presupposition. You're arguing that a valid argument with a false conclusion refutes a valid argument with an alleged true conclusion. In that case, this conclusion is not true, because I can make an equivalent argument with a false conclusion against it. This very argument you are making does not have a true conclusion because I can make an equivalent argument with a false conclusion against it. It's a self-refuting position. The atheist. No, I'm not saying my Godzilla argument necessarily refutes your argument about God, but I'm saying that because I can easily make an equivalent argument against your argument, then that proves that your argument for the God of the Bible doesn't actually prove anything at all. That's what I'm saying. Because I can easily make an equivalent argument against your argument, then that proves that your argument doesn't actually prove anything at all. You haven't proven that God exists. The Christian. In that case, your argument doesn't prove anything at all, because I can make an equivalent argument against yours. And according to you, that proves that your argument doesn't actually prove anything. So, you have not proven that your Godzilla argument refutes mine, and you have not demonstrated that your Godzilla argument proves that my argument doesn't prove anything. The presupposition of the Godzilla argument, or the Thor argument, or the Zeus argument, or the flying spaghetti monster argument is that if an equivalent valid argument with a false conclusion can be made against a valid argument with an alleged true conclusion, then that equivalent false argument refutes the alleged true argument. But the atheist thinks that this argument is true. All the Christian has to do, according to the atheist's logic, is to make up an equivalent argument to refute the atheist's argument. Yep, the atheist Godzilla argument, or the Thor argument, or the Zeus argument, or the flying spaghetti monster argument is self-refuting.